At 0347 hours local time, the USS Nimitz carrier strike group maintained its patrol pattern in the Arabian Sea, roughly 100 naughty miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz. The water was black glass, no moon, no wind, the kind of night when radar operators could hear their own heartbeats. On the flight deck of the supercarrier, a maintenance crew completed final checks on an aircraft that officially didn't exist in any naval inventory. The airframe resembled nothing in service with the U.S. Navy. No wings, no tail surfaces, no cockpit. What sat before them looked more like geometry than machinery, a perfectly symmetrical black diamond suspended on 4 engine pods, producing 35,000 pounds of thrust. This was the X-47C Phantom. It represented a generational leap in naval aviation that had been theoretically impossible just 5 years ago. The Pentagon had been developing unmanned combat air vehicles for 2 decades, but the X-47C wasn't just another drone. It was fully autonomous, capable of executing complex air-to-air combat maneuvers without human. It could think, not in the philosophical sense, but in the tactical sense that mattered. Its artificial intelligence had been trained on 40 years of aerial combat data. Every engagement the United States had fought since Vietnam, every missile shot, every turn radius exploited, every tactical principle encoded into neural networks. The machine learning algorithms that drove its decision-making had consumed over 3 million simulated combat scenarios. It knew the weaknesses in Iranian air defense doctrine because it had fought them 10,000 times in the digital realm. It knew the engagement envelopes of every air defense system Iran possessed because American engineers had fed it classified specifications collected by satellites and electronic warfare operators over decades. The official position of the Department of Defense that the X-47C didn't exist. The budgetary documents buried in Section 811 appropriations listed it as advanced platform testing. Defense contractors involved in its development operated under code names so compartmentalized that entire divisions of engineers had no idea what their components actually powered. Congress knew it existed because several appropriation committee members had been briefed in secure facilities, but public denial remained absolute. The Navy couldn't acknowledge it. The moment you admitted an aircraft could conduct autonomous air combat, you opened yourself to every arms control advocate, every international relations scholar, every ethicist who wanted to debate whether machines should make kill decisions. It was easier to pretend it didn't exist, deploy it anyway. At 0352 hours, the maintenance crew wheeled the X-47C into the catapult shuttle. The aircraft weighed 28,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel and ordnance. It carried 2 AIM-120D AMRAAM missiles internally, 2 more on external hardpoints, and a 20mm cannon with 500 rounds. The loadout was designed for one purpose: air superiority. The catapult officer ran through final per-flight checks, punching commands into a portable terminal connected to the aircraft through a fiber optic link. The X-47C's systems came alive. Engines spooled up to 60% power, then 80%. Hydraulic systems pressurized. Avionics booted through their startup sequences in perfect synchronization. The bird was ready, and it knew exactly what it was being asked to do. 300 miles to the west, in the Strait of Hormuz, the situation was deteriorating by the minute. An Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboat had captured a commercial tanker flagged to Singapore 3 hours earlier. The vessel was carrying refined petroleum products destined for Japan, a transit of Hormuz that happened 40 times per day under international law. The speedboat belonged to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, an organization that operated with calculated aggression designed to test American response times. They'd done this dance before. Iranian fast attack craft would harass a commercial vessel, usually releasing it within hours after extracting some intelligence or making whatever political point Tehran wanted to make. American carriers would surge air assets. Iranian fighters would scramble. Everybody would posture. Nobody would shoot. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a teenage game of chicken. But something had changed in the intelligence picture over the last 48 hours. American signals intelligence had picked up increased chatter on Iranian air defense networks. Radar systems were being moved. Air defense commanders were receiving operational briefings. Intercepted communications suggested something bigger was being planned. The CIA assessed the probability at 62% that Iran was preparing a coordinated attack on American assets in the Gulf. Not an imminent threat necessarily, but a threshold had been crossed. The rules of engagement had been modified accordingly. The standing orders from CENTCOM gave carrier strike group commanders authority to initiate combat operations if they assessed hostile intent as imminent. At 0358 hours, the catapult officer gave the final signal. The X-47T lurched forward on the shuttle track, accelerating from 0 to 25 knots in 2.2 seconds. The aircraft rotated off the bow of the carrier, climbing into the black Arabian night. Once airborne, the data link to the ship was severed. The aircraft was on its own. From this moment forward, it would execute its mission parameters through autonomous decision-making. decision-making. The fighter controller watching from the Nimitz Combat Information Center could observe the aircraft's progress on radar, could transmit new target coordinates if the tactical situation evolved, but that the moment decisions about how to engage the target belonged entirely to the machine. The X-47C climbed to 25,000 feet, accelerating to Mach 0.85. Its sensors reached out into the darkness, painting a picture of the airspace around it with such clarity that a human pilot sitting in a cockpit would have felt like they were seeing through fog by comparison. The aircraft's Raytheon AESA radar had 1,500 individual antenna elements arranged across its nose. Unlike mechanical radar systems that rotated and scanned sequentially, this radar could simultaneous hundreds of targets while maintaining continuous fire control on priority threats. The X-47C's electronic war suite included passive sensors that could detect radar emissions from 100 miles away, identifying not just the bearing and distance of potential threats, but the specific type of system doing the transmitting. At 0412 hours, the X-47C detected its first target, an Iranian F-4 Phantom fighter launching from Bandar Abbas Air Base, 140 nautical miles to the northwest. The F-4 was an aircraft that first flew in 1958. Iran still operated roughly 60 of them. Ancient airframes kept flying through a combination of ingenuity and desperation. The American aircraft's threat assessment subroutines immediately classified the contact as hostile based on course, altitude, and the Iranian air base of origin. The X-47C's tactical computer asked a simple question: was this aircraft a threat? The neural network considered the variables. Iranian Air Force had not scrambled fighters in response to the carrier strike group's presence in 347 days of this deployment. Current Iranian political messaging suggested de-escalation was preferred. This aircraft could be reconnaissance, it could be a training flight, it could be many things that didn't require immediate engagement. The X-47C assessed the threat as moderate and maintained its current course, continuing to track the F-4 as it climbed and accelerated. The machine's decision-making algorithms were sophisticated enough to the trap of binary thinking. Not every target was a threat to be engaged. Some targets were targets to be monitored, to be outmaneuvered, to be allowed freedom of movement while maintaining tactical advantage. The X-47C continued climbing, reaching 30,000 feet, where the thinner air rewarded its high-altitude performance advantage over the Iranian fighter. At 0427 hours, Iranian aircraft appeared on the X-7C's radar scope, an F-14 Tomcat, another aircraft from the 1970s, but this one handled with considerably more respect by the machine's threat assessment systems. The F-14 was a serious weapons platform, equipped with Phoenix missiles that could engage targets at extreme range. The aircraft mounted a sophisticated fire control radar and could operate as an interceptor or air-to-ground platform with respectable capability. Two Iranian fighters now, both climbing, both heading toward the X-47C's projected position. The machine considered this development. Was this a coordinated intercept? The tactical logic suggested yes. Iranian air defense was attempting to establish a fighter combat airport to challenge American operations over the Gulf. The X-47C's programming included a decision tree that had been thoroughly war-gamed by American air combat tacticians. If Iranian fighters attempted to intercept, what should the autonomous aircraft do? The instructions were clear: maintain tactical advantage, deny Iranian Air Force's effective employment of their weapons systems, use superior performance to establish favorable geometry for engagement. In practical terms, this meant the X-47C would maneuver to maintain altitude and speed advantage, would position itself for the maximum engagement envelope of its missiles while keeping the Iranian aircraft outside their own effective range. At 0433 hours, the F-14 Tomcat radar made contact the X-47C at 89 nautical miles. The Iranian pilot would have seen a target on his scope, a return that his threat library identified as potentially American. The aircraft was maintaining altitude advantage, was flying directly toward him, and was approaching his weapons employment range. The Iranian pilot transmitted a challenge on the international emergency frequency: unidentified aircraft, identify yourself or alter your heading. The X-47C's communication systems received and processed the transmission. The machine had no protocol to respond. It had no requirement to acknowledge. It had no diplomatic constraints. The aircraft continued its approach. At 0441 hours, the F-14's fire control radar illuminated 40C continuously, attempting to acquire and lock for missile firing solution. The machine's electronic warfare suite detected the illumination and immediately classified it as hostile. The threat assessment algorithms made their decision. This aircraft had just taken an action that constituted active targeting. In the American rules of engagement for this operation, active targeting by an adversary air defense or fighter aircraft constituted implicit hostile intent. The X-47C was now authorized to engage. The machine calculated the optimal firing firing solution. The F-14 Tomcat had a radar cross-section of approximately 8 square meters, a substantial target for American missiles designed to track objects the size of golf balls. The aircraft was flying at Mach 0.92, heading 315 degrees magnetic, altitude 24,000 feet. The X-47C was at 32,000 feet, heading 95 degrees, currently 67 nautical miles from the target. An AIM-120D AMRAAM from this geometry would have a 94% probability of kill, according to the statistical models loaded into the fire control computer. The machine made its decision. 2 missiles dropped from the aircraft's internal bays simultaneously. Their solid rocket motors ignited, accelerating each weapon from 0 to Mach 4 in less than 4 seconds. The missiles were guided by inertial navigation for the initial mid-course phase, taking heading and altitude updates transmitted from the X-47C via command data link. Once they reached the terminal phase, they would shift to active radar guidance, using their own seeker to home on the F-14's radar emissions. The complete flight time from launch to impact would be approximately 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The Iranian pilot saw the launch on his threat warning receiver the instant the missiles went active with their radar seekers. 16 missile symbols appeared on his scope simultaneously, even though only 2 missiles were in flight. The X-47C's electronic warfare package was generating false target symbols, Phantom missiles, that would overwhelm the Iranian aircraft's defensive reaction capacity. The pilot immediately deployed decoys, chaff dispensers, rapidly ejecting clouds of metallic strips designed to clutter the radar picture and confuse the incoming missiles. He turned hard left, pulling the F-14 into a 6G turn that would have rendered a human pilot unconscious. The aircraft was equipped with an automatic G-suit system that prevented the pilot from blacking out, but the maneuver still represented the absolute edge of human tolerance. The first AIM-120D was tracking on active radar guidance now, its seeker head locked onto the F-14's radar return. The Iranian aircraft's defensive maneuver was effective against missiles from the 1990s. It was catastrophically inadequate against a system from the 2020s. The missile's guidance system used advanced algorithms to predict the target's future position based on its current turn rate, was correcting its trajectory in real time to lead the interception point, was filtering out the decoy chaff using sophisticated discrimination logic that could distinguish between chaff returns and actual aircraft radar signatures. The terminal phase of the engagement became a competition between the F-14's evasive maneuvers and the missile's predictive guidance algorithms. The aircraft pulled harder, diving to build speed and increase turn radius. The missile followed, its control surfaces deflecting to adjust trajectory. At 12 nautical miles separation, the missile acquired the target on its active seeker and locked solid. The Iranian pilot executed a maximum G-turn that should have broken a missile from 2 decades prior. It merely delayed the inevitable. The AIM-120D impacted the F-14's fuselage at 3,200 feet per second, detonating its 44-pound warhead directly in the aircraft's engine inlet. The F-14 exploded in a ball of fire that was visible from 40 nautical miles in the darkness. The aircraft broke apart, pieces falling toward the Persian Gulf 24,000 feet below. The second AIM-120D that had been launched simultaneously impacted the debris field, ticketing a kill on a target already fatally damaged. The engagement was complete in minutes and 53 seconds from missile launch to impact. The Iranian pilot never had a chance to fire a single missile in return. On the flight deck of the USS Nimitz, the Combat Information Center erupted in controlled chaos. The fighter controller who had been monitoring the X-47C saw the radar signature of the F-14 disappear from the scope. Satellite confirmation came 15 seconds later, thermal imagery showing the massive infrared signature of the explosion. The machine had engaged. The machine had won. The machine had done it all autonomously, from target detection to terminal intercept, without a human finger on any trigger. At 0448 hours, the F-4 Phantom that had been climbing toward the X-47C's position abruptly turned away. The Iranian pilot had likely received word that his wingman had just been killed by an incoming missile. He wasn't willing to follow his colleague into whatever was shooting down Iranian fighters with perfect efficiency. The aircraft turned south toward Bandar Abbas, accelerating at full military power. The X-47C tracked the retreat, maintained its position, and waited to see if additional threats would emerge. At Iranian Air Defense Command headquarters in Tehran, the situation was unfolding as an absolute nightmare. The radar operators watched the blip representing the F-14 simply vanish from the scope. No gradual degradation of signal, no fading return. Complete disappearance, indicative of a catastrophic loss of the aircraft. The commander immediately ordered all airborne assets to return to base. Whatever was operating in Iranian airspace, it had just demonstrated the capability to kill a modern fighter aircraft at range with a 100% success rate on the first engagement. The calculation calculus of engagement had fundamentally changed. Iranian Air Force was standing down, but the situation at sea was still deteriorating. The captured commercial tanker remained in the hands of Revolutionary Guard speedboats. American surface combatants were steaming toward the interdiction point at maximum sustainable speed. The rules of engagement had been adjusted again following the loss of the F-14. Now any Iranian naval vessel that failed to distance itself from the captured merchant ship would be engaged and destroyed. The message had been sent through kinetic means. The F-14 kill was a demonstration. The next engagement would be against Iran's navy. At 0552 hours, the X-47C was returning to the USS Nimitz, its fuel state dictating an immediate recovery. The aircraft had been airborne for approximately 85 minutes, had consumed fuel at a rate that roughly 12% of total capacity remaining. The landing would be automated as well. The machine would approach the ship at exactly the correct angle, would lower its landing gear, would trap the arresting cable without pilot intervention, and would power down in the parking spot designated by the flight deck crew. It had launched autonomously. It would recover autonomously. Humans were now spectators to a process they had initiated but could no longer control in its execution. The X-47C lined up on the carrier's flight deck for approach. The landing signal officer, a function that had existed since the birth of naval aviation, was now purely ceremonial. The aircraft didn't see his signals. The machine guided itself to touchdown using GPS accuracy within inches, radar altimetry to within feet, and inertial navigation systems that could maintain position references without any external input. The aircraft descended. Its wheels touched the deck. The arresting cable caught the tailhook. The X-47C decelerated from 165 knots to 0 in 2.3 seconds, settling into the parking spot as if guided by an invisible hand. The flight deck crew moved in to secure the aircraft. Mechanics were already running through mental checklists in preparation for the next sortie. The X-47C was already being refueled, wormed, and prepared for whatever the next operational requirement would be. The machine sat on the deck, its systems cycling through automated maintenance sequences, diagnosing its own status, updating its own software based on the combat data it had collected. In the Strait of Hormuz, the situation was reaching a critical juncture. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard boat that was holding the commercial tanker suddenly received instructions to release the vessel. The order came from Tehran. The political calculus had shifted. Iran had just watched a machine designed and deployed by the United States military conduct a perfect intercept and shoot down one of their fighter aircraft. The message was unmistakable. Escalation would be met with force that Iran could not match, could not defend against, and could not negotiate away. The captured tanker was released. The speedboat departed the area at high speed. American surface combatants arrived on scene within 30 minutes. The commercial vessel was assessed, inspected for any damage or contraband, and released to continue its transit. The incident was officially resolved. What wasn't resolved was the strategic shock that had just rippled through Tehran. The United States had deployed a weapon system that Iran couldn't stop, a fighter aircraft that required no pilot, a machine that could think, could decide, could execute tactical decisions at the speed of a computer processor rather than the speed of human cognition. At 0847 hours local time, an emergency meeting convened in Tehran. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders presenting their assessment to the Supreme Leader's Security Council. The presentation included the radar telemetry from the F-14's final moments, the trajectory data of the missiles that had killed it, and the technical assessment of what they were facing. The consensus was sobering. Iran had no defense against an autonomous air system that could operate speeds, altitudes, and with precision that far exceeded anything in the Iranian inventory. Their air force was effectively neutralized as a deterrent. Their air defense system had demonstrated its inadequacy. Their only remaining option was deterrence through strategic weapons. The discussion shifted to ballistic missile. Iran possessed several variants of the Shahab-class ballistic missile with sufficient range to strike at American bases throughout the region. The missiles weren't as accurate as they needed to be against moving naval targets, but they could strike fixed bases. They could cause casualties. They could create a cost-benefit calculation that might make continued American military presence in the region untenable. But launching ballistic missiles at American forces would constitute an act of war in the legal sense, would provide justification for American retaliation on a scale that would be devastating to Iranian infrastructure and military capability. The discussion deteriorated it into argument. On the USS Nimitz, flight operations resumed at 45 hours local time. The X-47C was launched for a sortie. This time, the target was different. Instead of intercepting aircraft, the machine was tasked with establishing dominance over Iranian air defense radar sites. The aircraft flew at 28,000 feet, its electronic warfare equipment actively mapping every radar emission coming from Iranian air defense installations across the southern coast. Every radar site was identified, located, and electronically dynamically characterized. The X-47C gathered targeting data that would be used for future attacks, future missions, future operations designed to neutralize Iran's ability to defend its own airspace. At 130 hours, a new diplomatic cable was transmitted from the Iranian Foreign Ministry to Switzerland, requesting an urgent back-channel conversation with American representatives. The message was clear. Iran wanted to discuss terms for de-escalation. Calculus had shifted entirely. What had been a situation where Iran was testing American resolve had become a situation where Iran was seeking a face-saving exit. The loss of the F-14, the demonstration of American technological superiority, and the deployment of a weapons system that Iran had no counter to had all combined to shift the balance of power in a way that was unmistakable. At 13:47 hours, 47C returned to the USS Nimitz for recovery. It had been airborne for 96 minutes on its second sortie, had established positive identification and targeting solutions for 14 separate Iranian radar installations, and had deployed electronic warfare jamming that rendered every air defense system across southern Iran temporarily blind. The aircraft had not fired a shot on this mission. The mission had been intelligence gathering and electronic warfare demonstration. The point had been made. The machine could operate with impunity in Iranian airspace. Nothing Iran possessed could stop it. The aircraft was recovered, refueled, and rearmed once again. Its weapons bays held fresh AEM-20D missiles. Its fuel tanks were topped off. Its electronic warfare suite had uploaded the latest Iranian air defense parameters into its threat library. The machine was ready for whatever the next sortie would require. In Tehran, the Security Council meeting had concluded with a directive to Iran's military leadership: stand down all offensive operations, recall all air defense units from elevated readiness, diplomatic overtures to international mediators. The calculus was clear. Iran could not win a military confrontation with the United States when the U.S. Navy was deploying weapon systems that didn't require human pilots, that could execute combat maneuvers at speeds beyond human tolerance, that could think, decide, and engage targets autonomously. The age of human-piloted air superiority had ended. The age of autonomous combat had begun. At 600 hours, news of the F-14 shootdown was beginning to leak through international media channels. The first reports were confused and contradictory. Some sources claimed the aircraft had been shot down by a manned American fighter. Others suggested it was lost to surface-to-air missiles. The Pentagon issued a carefully worded statement confirming that an Iranian F-14 had been destroyed during what was described as routine operations over the Persian Gulf, made no mention of the X-47C. The statement made no mention of autonomous systems. The statement made no mention of any weapon system that officially didn't exist. What the Pentagon did provide was sufficient attribution and context for every military analyst in the world understand exactly what had happened. An American air superiority platform operating from a carrier in the Persian Gulf had intercepted an Iranian fighter aircraft and engaged it at beyond visual range. The Iranian aircraft had been destroyed with a probability of survival of essentially zero. The message was clear without requiring explicit statement. America had deployed a capability that Iran couldn't counter. The balance of power in the region had fundamentally shifted. On the flight deck of the USS Nimitz, the X-47C sat in its parking spot, its engines cold, its systems in maintenance mode. The machine had flown 2 combat sorties in a single day. It had engaged 1 target and achieved a perfect kill. It had conducted electronic warfare and intelligence gathering on a second mission. By any measure, the system had performed flawlessly. The artificial intelligence algorithms that guided its decision-making had proven themselves superior to human military judgment in the specific context of rapid air-to-air engagement. What the system hadn't demonstrated was something more important. It hadn't demonstrated the ability to make decisions that required understanding of political context, diplomatic nuance, or the long-term strategic implications of specific tactical actions. The machine had followed its programming to engage an Iranian fighter that was actively attempting to lock it with targeting radar. But the decision to deploy the X-47C in the first place, the decision to make it operational, the decision to authorize its use in combat, these decisions had required human judgment at the strategic level. At 18:47 hours, the X-47C was secured. Further sorties were anticipated in the immediate future. The diplomatic back-channel messages from Tehran suggested that Iran was seeking de-escalation. The carrier strike group maintained its presence in the Arabian Sea, but the active threat posture had been reduced. American forces remained at high readiness, but the immediate risk of a major kinetic engagement had decreased significantly. In the weeks and months that would follow, the implications of what had happened on this day would ripple through military establishments worldwide. Every major power understood that the rules of air combat had fundamentally changed. Human pilots, no matter how well trained, couldn't compete with machines machines that process information faster, could execute maneuvers with higher G loadings, and could make tactical decisions without the cognitive delays inherent in human perception and response. The X-47C Phantom represented a threshold that had been crossed, not just a technological threshold, but an ontological one. For the first time in human history, a fully autonomous weapons system had engaged an adversary in combat and achieved victory without human intervention in the moment of engagement. The machine had decided to kill. The machine had executed that decision. The machine had succeeded. What it meant for the future of warfare, for the future of international relations, and for the future of human control over weapons systems remained to be seen. But on this day, in the Arabian Sea, the future of combat had arrived. It arrived on the wings of an aircraft that officially didn't exist, piloted by intelligence algorithms that had been trained on the recorded history of human aerial combat. It had been deployed by a military establishment that understood the capabilities it possessed and was willing to take the strategic risk of demonstrating those capabilities to a regional adversary that lacked the means to respond effectively. Iran had learned a lesson about the asymmetry of modern military power. The United States had demonstrated a capability that would reshape how regional powers calculated their risk assessments. And on the flight deck of the USS Nimitz, an aircraft that shouldn't exist sat in the darkness, ready for whatever the next mission would require, waiting in silence, thinking in mathematics, armed and prepared for a kind of warfare that human beings were only beginning to understand.